Oasis. Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am Scott Allen, and thanks to my daughter Kate for developing the intro to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast, where we offer a smart, fast-paced discussion on all things leadership. My guests help us explore timely topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. If you haven't done so, please click subscribe so you automatically, seamlessly stay in the know when we publish new episodes. Likewise, please provide me with feedback. What do you like? What do you dislike? And what else would you like to know? And now, today's show. Okay, welcome everybody. I hope you're having a great day. We have Dr. Kathy Guthrie with us today on the program, and she's an associate professor of higher education in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at Florida State University. She leads the Leadership Learning Research Center at FSU, and she's also in charge of the Undergraduate Certificate. She also has a family and is an author and a scholar and just an incredibly good person. So I'm excited for all of you today. For those of you who may not know Dr. Guthrie, I'm excited for you to meet her. Now, she also is an associate editor on the New Directions in Leadership series. And I believe, Kathy, Susan is kind of the editor on that, right? Susan Comavez?
She is, and I get to learn from her daily, which is beautiful.
So Kathy, thank you for being with us. Thanks for spending your time. For those of you who are listening, when we're recording this, it is literally probably the first day of school for both of our institutions, our children. There's a lot going on. So thank you for being here. Would you tell our guests a little bit about you, Kathy?
Oh, yes. Well, thank you for having me. This is such an honor to be able to have conversation. I love taking the time anytime I can with you, Scott, honestly, because I love being in that space and learning from you. But so a little bit about myself, I am in the context of higher education. I worked in administration and higher ed, and that's where I got my Ph.D. and actually come to leadership through a lens of service. I was a director of the Office of Volunteer Programs for many years when I was getting my Ph.D. at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Yeah. And so I realized how much that has shaped my framework and my lens is that administrative hat that I still currently, wear as a director and a coordinator.
Yeah. Well, so tell me a little bit more about that. Tell me more about the service learning lens and how it's kind of informed how you think about this topic. I mean, that's a really cool lens to look at this through.
Yeah, it really is. I did actually a couple of years of community organizing as well. And so I think about leadership as how are we, having positive, sustainable change? And that is in multiple contexts, right? So the community aspect in the sense of service, which as we all know is part servant leadership, but much bigger than servant leadership, and kind of that theory around how we are and why we need leadership. And so the community framework has helped me look at the topic of leadership from multiple disciplines, right? Yeah. That sometimes aren't. And I just have appreciated that service piece of it. Someone asked me years ago, so what do you think you're put on this earth to do? And I was like, serve. And I think of that through education. And that education can be a conversation, walking somewhere, and not just with students, but with friends and that lifespan approach. It could be anyone, but how are we in this together? And so I think about that in the community aspect.
Yeah. Well, and you recently finished a book. It was called The Role of Leadership Educators, Transforming Learning. Would you talk a little bit about that? Share some stories about the impetus of that book, how it came to be, what you learned through that process. I'd love to hear that story.
Yes, well,
because Kathy, we've been at so many conferences together, but this is literally one of the first conversations one-on-one we've ever had. So I'm excited.
Yes, well, we're typically in a group, right?
We're in a group drinking wine with Laura Osteen. Yes,
I know, yes, right. Yes, so and it's funny, the role of leadership educators. I call it the butterfly book because the cover has butterfly, and it's about transforming. And I got the pleasure of writing that with Dan Jenkins, which I know Dan, and we had him on. But it really was from a place of, wow, we don't know what how are leadership educators trained? And we really don't know.
Yeah.
And I know that when I first got into the field, I was perpetuating so many bad things because I was creating leadership programs in a curricular and co-curricular format that was how I learned, which is one white woman's perspective. And so I was just perpetuating that. And so in our program, in the higher education program, they said, we need a course for student affairs administrators to be able, because they're leadership educators. And so how do you want to do this course? Literally, I walked into a faculty meeting and I come out with creating a new course that is a required part of our curriculum. And I was like, there are no books out there that really has it all in one space. And I was talking to the publisher just about ideas, and he said, well, then write it. And so I was like, Dan, you're the curriculum and education, curriculum and instruction person. How about if we do this together? And it was a great, great partnership for us to be able to work on together. And so that was really the start of it. Was there's not, a lot of resources. There's a lot of piecemeal things that you can put together, but to have something that's comprehensive is really where that book came from. So.
Well, and take us through some highlights of that resource, just so listeners have a perspective on how you all approached that project.
Yeah, so we looked at it from a leadership learning framework, which actually draws a lot on your work, Alan. You did an article in 2016 about I think it's called The Language of Leadership Learning.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. We took a lot of the thought from your article and looking at, so we know about the TED model, the training, education, and development model, and then how else has that evolved over the time? And so it's really looking at the learning piece. So it's great that we talk about leadership education and that leadership educators, but really we need to be flipping the script and talking about learners. Who is in our classroom? Who is going to our leadership development programs, and then thinking about those individuals, the learners. And again, that is not just college students, right? That is put in whatever population you want, and then going from there. And so we talked about we have 6 aspects of leadership learning, and we have a great little visual that's a steering wheel, because to be a learner, you have to also take control of your own learning. So yeah, that was really the start of, well, that's great. We're going to talk about the learners, and that's the first half of the book. And then the second half looks at specific pedagogy. And so we talk about different pedagogy, but what are examples? And just actually a few months ago, we came out with a companion manual to have actual activities that people can really grasp onto and grab and say, okay, this is an idea of how to use a case study. That's just not the same old case studies that we use, but how can we really make it specific and intentional for our learners?
Well, I love that you've done that, because I think sometimes we get so caught up in, well, I think an Achilles heel of our work is that so much is left undefined. And I think Barbara Kellerman, in my discussion with her on this topic, she said, I don't even really care how you're defining leadership, just define it so people have an understanding. And I think that's a major, it's a fundamental baseline struggle that we have. What's the difference between education, learning, studies, training, development, right? And I think clarity on some of that terminology, regardless of the nuances of what words you choose, but clarity on that seems to me to be a foundation from which we then build. But there's a lot of well-intended people, myself included, to your point, right? When I first started this, I came up through Greek life. And that's the first time I ever really designed leadership education. Well, I didn't have your book to even begin to guide the way. I'd read the Leadership Challenge, right? That was it. And so there's a lot of opportunity, because then I think if we have some of that foundation in place, then we can look to instructional strategies, we can look to evaluation techniques, and we can do it with so much more intentionality. Because I think that's part of the challenge, is that there's a lot happening out there. I don't know how much is really happening with some semblance of intentionality. And I don't say that like, oh, I have all the answers, I've figured this out. But you know what I mean? I think anything we can do to get a little more close to, oh, we want to facilitate personal growth and kind of take a humanistic lens. Great. Here's how we can think about that orientation to learning and do so in a very planful way, right?
Absolutely. And I think also naming those that we might have overlooked before, like observation is a huge way. I mean, I
Yeah.
think of all the times that I observe and I learn, but
Yep.
we don't acknowledge that. And I
Yep.
think of I have a 7-year-old daughter and I look at how she observes,
Yes.
even what she's seeing on TV.
Yep.
And then that is how she defines leadership.
Yep.
And so we have to have that reflection and that meaning making from observation. But that's oftentimes we don't acknowledge that observation is a way of learning,
Yeah.
not just leadership, but everything. And
Oh, for sure. For sure. That whole social learning dimension, the Albert Bandura piece, and, all of that, the social cognitive kind of, yes. And I think getting a sense and getting our hands around some of the definitions, again, regardless of kind of how you define them, but then, okay, if this is what I'm trying to accomplish, now here's some, like we said, instructional strategies. Here's some activities. Here's some resources. Here's how we could evaluate that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's awesome. So what was your greatest learning in the process of writing the book from a content standpoint? Is there anything that stood out for you where at the end you said, wow, I've never thought about it this way?
Well, you know what hit me? Oh, I would say flatten me. You have those moments when you're writing something and then you have that moment of, we missed the boat, right? And I
Yeah.
had the conversation with Dan. I said, we have got to now step back and recalibrate a little bit. And it was around identity of educators. So this book is for leadership educators, the butterfly book,
Yep.
my air quotes, that it's for leadership educators, but we're not talking about our own identity as educators. And I'm, yes, professional identity, like Priest and C. Miller's work, but also our social identities, what's salient for us, the intersections of our identities, how that shows up every time that we are talking about leadership. Because since leadership is socially constructed and how our identity matters, I remember having that conversation with Dan saying, oh my goodness, this needs to be like the second chapter, because that frames the rest of it. And we were, well on our way for being done with the book. And I was like, we need to pull back, and there actually should be a book just on that, but here we need to honor and start scratching the surface of that conversation about identity as leadership educators, and more, I would say, professional identity, but really salient identity, and how, say, a Black male would be, messages received differently than myself as a white female. And so how are we taking those into considerations and having the conversations in our intentional planning?
Yeah.
Right. So
no, I think it's incredibly important because I think it's such a wise observation, because that's another thing. Literally, Kathy, and probably because I am a white male, and I've just, in some cases, I haven't had to think about certain dimensions of stuff. In the last 5 months of really working on this podcast, I've done a lot of exploration and learned a lot. And there's guests that have really, it's funny because certain guests will say, well, you've read this and you've read that. And I'm sitting here saying, no, I haven't. I don't know what you mean. And I'm being stretched, but kind of what I'm just laying at the feet of the students, if I'm not in tune with who I am, where I come from, where I see the world, what privilege I have, any number of different dimensions, that's a missed opportunity. And in
absolutely.
some cases could be damaging, right?
Right. Well, and to have the missed opportunity of having a connection with a student that may have never identified as a leader before.
Yep.
I mean, I remember having that conversation one time with a student, and I said, I didn't identify as a leader until I was in college because of my personal background. And they just looked at me like, wow, I would never have guessed that. You're a leadership educator, like you are my professor. And I was like, oh, yes, but I'm from a farm town in central Illinois, very poverty, stricken area. So it was just never one of those things that we talked about. And I think about that greatly now that I'm seeing my daughter and her ideas and views of leadership come up all the time. And I know,
Really?
there's a lot of great research on that. And I'm not It's not my area of research, but my observation, because you do learn by observation.
Yeah.
It's been, fascinating.
Talk about the children's book. I'd love to hear that
Yes.
story. I'd love to hear that story because you've just mentioned your daughter, which then
Yes.
flagged and reminded me that you've done some work in that space as well, which is so cool.
Yes. Oh, so there is a superhero. She's a girl. Her name's Chloe.
Yeah, so Marvelous and Kind Chloe, she is a girl superhero, and it is a phenomenal story. It actually is the illustrator and the co-author of the books is my husband's cousin. And I say that because it is a prime example of someone who has brilliant talent, and she was doodling on a family vacation, and I said, "Can you make that into a superhero girl for my daughter?" And then as we continued the conversation, we said, we really need to make Chloe come alive.
Wow.
And so we started writing books, and there's one just about, kind of sets her up as a person who, she's a superhero, of course, in this phenomenal world. Well, it's called University City. So people know university and how that connects with me, but it is an incredible story of how she needed to ask for help and she figured out how to. And then it went on to how Chloe learned about leadership. Wow. Because we were seeing those gaps in younger, especially like preschool, pre-K, kindergarten, and how they were thinking only their views of leadership was the line leader. And so that book really introduced different ways of looking at leadership. And then we have a third one about being grateful. So we're continually figuring out how to bring Chloe into the forefront of not only because Danielle, the co-author, has a daughter as well. And that's where Chloe comes from, Kinley, and her daughter's name is Zoe. So it's a fun way of really putting forward girl kind of empowerment and thinking of, how are we all superheroes and being kind.
Well, and in some of my conversations, whether it was with Susan Murphy or even David Day mentioned this, some of the lifespan work, that if with our children, we can be formulating and helping them think through and even define earlier, what is leadership? Can I be a leader? To your point, it's not just being a line leader and influence. And so I just love that. I absolutely love that. And then again, moving forward in just other books where Chloe is the whole notion of gratitude and being grateful, right? Mm-hmm. So we've had to work on that quite a bit this summer with our children. We just started classes today. And I believe there's some, to your point about observing others, my wife and I, we knew that as soon as we got into summer, it was going to be a different summer. And how do you help them navigate that path of, okay, it's going to be different because ours are 10 and 12, but also find all the great good and the opportunity. Even though we've lost some things, we can still, now, of course, that's a very privileged statement that I'm making, but how do we reframe so that there's gratitude? And even last night at dinner, we talked about, well, what are you grateful for from the summer? Right. And they each had, they had wonderful summers, right?
Right. It's powerful. It really is.
Yep. So what are you thinking about right now, Kathy? What's on your mind? Do you have some projects that are kind of, I'm sure you do. What projects are simmering either on the front burner or the back burner? What are you thinking about?
Yeah. So really where my mind is all the complexities this pandemic has shown us.
Yeah.
I feel that it has put the spotlight on so many things that, and I say we collectively, we're too busy. Me by myself is too busy to really slow down and think about or to acknowledge. And the complexities are, and not, yes, we're in frameworks of education and leadership and business, but how that's in every industry, and leadership cuts across all those industries, and how that spotlight has shown us how we need to be more agile, right? Prepare and think about crisis, not only management, but leadership.
Yeah.
I think about again, that identity piece, cultural relevance. I think the Black Lives Matter movement has shown me and really caused me to pause in ways that I haven't in the past. I mean, I've always thought about it. I've always done work in socially just leadership education and culturally relevant leadership learning model, but to think about my role and how and when I am, being part of the problem or part of the solution, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And really having those honest conversations with myself and others. But I'm also thinking about differences between diversity, inclusion, and equity, and how pulling those apart. And it's interesting in how different industries and different people will use those terms very differently. And so, I know of places that have diversity checklists, right? And how that is very different than from the conversation of inclusion.
Yeah.
And especially inclusive leadership, because that is becoming more and more. And I know that you just recently had a guest that talked about that. But so then how do we not only include people, right? Include everyone, but then also how are we making sure that it's equitable and that what we're doing is culturally relevant? So all of those, I mean, how do we hold these multiple truths and continue to move forward?
Yeah. Yeah. There's it's a fascinating context right now. The complexity, to your point, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's overwhelming.
Yes. And so those multiple complexities are all coming together. And I think, we're seeing it more now than I think in a lot of times in recent history. Absolutely. But even when we look at, history in a longer sense, just with elections and, right now it's almost, I don't want to say a perfect storm because that's not it, but how is this all coming together in this moment in time, and how we will figure out what leadership and how will that continue to move us forward, in which ways will it move us forward?
Yeah. What models can you think of? Even you could look at this through the transformational leadership, situational leadership. We could look at this through a number of different lenses. What they all feel like they break down for me. I can't turn to situational leadership in this moment. I can't turn to LMX theory. And I know that some of those are not designed for kind of what we're facing. But are there models or theories that you're finding relevance in right now?
Yeah, I don't think there's one perfect model ever or theory. Never. But what I've really been rereading, deeply thinking about is, of course, adaptive leadership. I mean, I think that is an absolute no-brainer almost, but then also how is that situated in this culturally relevant leadership learning? And again, that is thinking about what is our environment, what is around us, how does that play a part in how we identify as a leader, engage in the leadership process, of course, our capacity and efficacy, how are we critical of things around us and what is happening. So it has been a deep many moments of thinking through. And then also going back to, everyone's hot on Hamilton. And I've been in love with Hamilton for years, but then to think about, wow, isn't that interesting? Our founding fathers and what some of the things that they were engaged in, and that, Alexander Hamilton was 19. And so we are seeing this happening again, and how different, or is it different?
Yeah.
Right. So I'm thinking a lot about the just increase of complexity. And with that, it's like, how do you break that down for projects? I am working on a few things. One is a co-edited book with Dr. V. Chanu. Okay. And we had an edited book that came out in 2018 called Changing the Narrative, Socially Just Leadership Education. And that was just a collection of voices to really talk about what socially just leadership education is. And just to start the conversation. Yep. It was not all inclusive because by the sheer, it's a book, we couldn't, but how are we just dipping our toe, kind of how are we starting the conversation? And so the second book is Shifting the Mindset, which is continuing the conversation. And the whole idea is this call to action. Like, yes, we are engaging in the conversation, but it's much more about what is that call to action? How are we collectively doing this work? And when I say this work, that it depends on the context you're in and whether that is, focusing on followership, I could list all of it, but really thinking about that socially just leadership education and really thinking about collective voices in this process. And so that's one of them. And it's been powerful in continuing that process. So
what's an insight from that project that stood out for you so far?
How we're all in this kind of, the complexity is overwhelming, but how do we continue to move forward by leaning into the conversations and calling other people in instead of out?
Yep.
Right. So how do we call people into the conversation and saying, oh, you use that wrong word, or, and instead saying, let's have that conversation. And it's been powerful for me because I've used wrong words and I've had people say, Kathy, I just want to educate you. And I'm like, thank you. Thank you for making me, a part of this conversation. So that has been a big insight for me, is just how are we also being in that space and in that story and that narrative together.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about empathy and in many ways the lack of empathy that's occurring in the system right now. It's, winners, losers, right, wrong, this, that, good, bad. And of course it's more difficult than that. And how do we get whether it's ourselves, I mean, that's enough of a challenge at times. How do we get ourselves, our groups, our communities to better empathize and try to understand the perspective of others, try to understand the lived experiences of others, and to your point, engage in those conversations, engage in those dialogues so that we evolve, not just I, but we. But what's the holding environment? Back to kind of a little bit of Heifetz. What's the holding environment for that? And how do you mobilize enough people to begin? Because that's also really scary work. That's hard work. How do you think about that? Do you agree?
No, it is. It's very hard and scary, and you're putting yourself out there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it absolutely is. And I think about I think there are multiple holding environments, and there needs to be, right? Because that context is just so important. And I know multiple leadership scholars and practitioners say that, but I think keeping that in the forefront of our mind is really critical. And thinking about, the Black Lives Matter movement, this has been happening for how long? I mean, it's just constant. And I think about the exhaustion that my colleagues that are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, where I know my privilege that I can step outside and not think about it because I'm white. Right? And so how do I not only the empathy, but thinking about, are there ways that we can amplify voices and then be like, I'm out, right? Like, this isn't about me, this is about you. And I'm just, trying to facilitate. Or when is that even harmful? Because that is harmful as well. And so having, right, the intention versus impact conversation, but it is exhausting. And so I think about just taking care of each other in those conversations and that's easier said than done. Absolutely. Yeah. But something we need to be thinking about, especially as we roll into November. I think gets heated even more so, and not just in the education industries, in all industries, right? I mean, it has really shown a spotlight on healthcare, in law, you name it. I think it's been.
Well, and also you coming from a small town in Illinois, where if that's what's the name of the town, Kathy?
Oh, Ashcombe. It's 600 people. Okay.
So I grew up in Minneapolis, but I grew up going to Fort Dodge, Iowa. And that's where my grandfather and grandmother lived, and my aunt and uncle and cousin. And Fort Dodge, my grandfather worked at Hormel his whole career. He didn't have a college education. He didn't have a high school education. Mm-hmm. He was an electrician for Hormel. And he could provide a good living. And a lot of those communities are struggling. I don't know if you're seeing that back home, but a lot of those communities are struggling as well.
Yes. No, that is for sure. I think that that's the other piece, right, of this complexity is the social class, right? So the intersections of all these different identities.
Yes.
It is powerful when we think about, and social class is something I've thought about my entire life. I didn't even know I was poor until I went to college, right? Like, didn't even cross my mind, didn't even know that wasn't a part of my narrative or my identity until I realized, oh, other people don't go to Goodwill for their clothes. I was like, oh, okay. Again, that is part of my identity. And I think about that, but how that complexity and those intersections, right, of identity. And so how now I am very much middle class and I don't have to worry about where my next meal is going to come from and so forth. But then how does that, how do I create space for others? And I say this to some of my PhD students. I am first gen all the way, but my decision to go to get my terminal degree was that I had a place at the table. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that was my number one motivator so that I could give voice when no one in my area, I mean, most people didn't have high school educations, right? So that I could give voice. And so I think about how important that is when we think about leadership, that process, but then also the leader. And then how are we providing space and place and, that relevance for students who might not identify from these different populations to have those conversations and to even engage in it.
Yep.
So.
Yep. Kathy, when you figure this out, would you just send me an email and give me the answer?
No, we all need to be doing this together, right? It's a call that as we all take our little pieces of this complex kind of topic area, how are we doing it together, right? I mean, that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, I have great respect. I have great respect for just the breadth of the work. So let's talk about that for a moment. The breadth of the type of work you're doing, whether that's being in the classroom or it's children's books. You and Corey Seemiller put together another resource with cards that I saw last November. You're writing journal articles, you're writing books. Talk about that. Do you just have an endless energy for this topic? Is there a deep reservoir of fuel? And for the many varieties of work that you're doing, would you talk a little bit about that? Because it's inspiring. As soon as people see the show notes, and I've linked to all of the different things that you're working on, it's really fun. It's really fun. So would you talk a little bit about your process and the source of that? What do you think that is?
Yeah. Well, honestly, the source is my daughter. I will be so honest about that because, and it didn't come to me until she was a couple of years old and someone said, so why do you do this work? It was a simple question. Yeah. And all of a sudden I got all this emotion and I'm like, because I want this world to be better for her, not just her, but her generation, right? Like I see where we move forward and then we move backwards and how can we get to a place where she's not dealing with the same stuff, let me just say that is happening right now or that we've dealt with. And so when I see her, that's like my life's mission, right? Like I'm here to serve and to figure out how to make this, this context, this world a little bit better, right? And so I think of that through education and starting the conversation. How many times I've just had a random conversation and people come back and say, oh, I never really thought about that until you mentioned that. And it's like, that's what education is, right? But as far as like the breadth of kind of projects, the other thing I would say is every day I feel so incredibly lucky to work with the people I do. Yeah. They are the ones that they continue to keep me where I need to be. But they have the brilliance and the knowledge. I'm lucky to work with a scholar, Dr. Cameron Beatty, who is also at Florida State. And I just feel lucky every day to be able to learn from him and for us to be able to figure out kind of some of these issues together. And so he's an example. There's a whole team, Dr. Sally Watkins, Dr. Marianne Lawrenson, and then right now we have 8 doc students that are working in the Leadership Learning Research Center. And it's really amazing to hear, and they're all focused on leadership, being a leadership educator and leadership scholar. And so all of them have their, specific areas that they're working on. And I love it because it's anywhere from global leadership to how do we incorporate leadership within career development. So it's really a wide spectrum, but it all focuses on that leadership learning. And so that, I would say, the breadth is also being able to be creative and knowing that journal articles or books aren't always the right way to get messages across, right? People can't really take it in and digest it and really use it. And so I know that I am very fortunate to have that team and those people in my company every day. I really, really do. So it's kind of the two-part, right? Like
yes.
Kinley is my motivation, my daughter, and
and the team.
And the team.
Well, and that's another wonderful thing about our work is that you can choose the team in some cases of who you want to write with and explore with, and which is so much fun. And I loved your answer. It's a beautiful answer about your daughter. Beautiful answer. Because I agree. I have 2 daughters myself. And just think, again, it was my conversation with Julie Owen where that really became front and center for me. Is, oh, wow. I hadn't thought of some of the things we discussed or that we discussed in that Inclusify with Stephanie Johnson episode, which again is learning for me, for sure.
Right. It is. It's so powerful. And, whenever my daughter will say, well, why? Or what, just the simple why, I'll be like, that's a good question. And I love it. I was on a call the other day and she came and sat on my lap. Right. But we were talking about these, how are we being more diverse and equitable and inclusive and having these conversations. And then her asking me some of the questions afterwards was like, no, you're asking exactly the question that we all should be asking, Kinley. You really are. And so that is a moment of learning and thinking from a 7-year-old framework that when you have to tell your daughter why, so why are Black men getting killed? Why? Wait, because their skin's, what? Well, I don't get, and literally, I don't understand it. And I'm like, we don't either. And that's why we need to change it. Right. Or whatever, however we frame that. Yeah. But those questions, it's powerful to be able to have those conversations with her to then push my thinking along as well. And wow, such a simple question that's not simple. Right.
And it's so interesting to see their observations the first time they learn that that's a thing. The processing that you can visibly see on their faces, whether it's sadness or worry, or it's an amazing moment that I've never even thought of until you just verbalized it right there with your daughter. But yes, I mean, that's happening often. And part of it is their age and stage, where they're becoming more aware of the world around them, whether it's something that happens at school or with a friend or something that happens on the news or any number of other outlets. But that moment when they learn some of those things about the world and that innocent, well, why is that a thing? Why is that even, I don't get it. To your point.
Right.
Yes.
Yes. And then that gives me more motivation to say, how do we engage in these conversations? Right. Right. So, and the other thing about the Marvelous and Kind Chloe book is we were very intentional about, well, so who's represented in this book?
Yeah.
Who are the superheroes? Who are, and was very thoughtful about making sure that anyone could pick it up and see themselves in it. And that was, even to like hairstyles, right? Everything. And it takes a lot more work than people would think, right? To really be intentional about every little piece of even a picture, because that does really, it's worth 1,000 words, right? Yeah. So, and how is that being displayed in all aspects of my life and my work? So I think about that quite a bit. Yeah.
Kathy, we are at time. We've been going for about 40 minutes. And so it's time for the lightning round. The lightning round is really, it's just about what you're streaming, what you're listening to, what you're reading, maybe what you're watching. Anything standing out for you as you've reflect on summer that you really enjoyed?
I allowed the summer to put me down a lot of rabbit holes. I went down, I would be reading something and I'd be, oh, that's an interesting citation. And then I went and bought the book, right? I do that a lot this summer. Normally I'm very intentional about my 20 books I read every summer. This is what I'm going to do. But I let myself wander a little bit. The one, I will say, book that I've been thinking about, and I read it probably about a month ago, it's about play. And it's an older book. It's in 2010. Actually, it's right here on my desk. Stuart Brown, Play, How It Shapes the Brain, Opens the Imagination, and Invigorates the Soul.
Wow.
And it was such a great, not only just a great text, but great moments in there to think about how important play is for that creativity. And so when my daughter's like, hey, let's play for 10 minutes. I'm like, you better believe it. But in the book, it talks about, I am all for it, right? Well, let me do the laundry. No, the laundry, come on. But it has a great kind of opening visual of, when dogs get really excited and they're like so excited and they run so fast that they run right past you and then they stop and then they come back and they dart back and forth, how those 30 seconds are pure joy for them. And so the author talks about, well, how do we do that more for ourselves?
Wow.
And how we can just release, and then come back. And I have been very intentional about doing that. And it has changed my attitude. We were talking about gratitude, just kind of my appreciation for where I'm at and what I'm able to do. I think about Hamilton, he's on my mind as well, but how lucky we are to be alive right now, where it seems like there's a lot of complexity and heaviness. How can I be thankful that, wow, I'm able to be alive and be a part of the change that's needed? And so how can I incorporate play to help me not be so exhausted, to be able to move forward and do that? So I would definitely recommend Play, with the long subtitle, by Stuart Brown, because it was wonderful. He's like founder of some National Institute of Play, which I was like, this is wonderful. So,
talk about a wonderful world to surround yourself with, right?
Yes, right.
I'm going to focus on play,
I know. And just how important it is. I will also say my mom is one of the most playful people. And I've really grown to appreciate that about her. Not really kind of forgot that about her, but now really appreciating and how she has informed my thought about that. So I would say that's the one thing that has really been incorporating. So I tried to stream and do everything around fun, laughing a lot.
I love it. Well, when I think of you, Kathy, I think of laughing a lot, because we should shout out our good friend Laura Osteen. Every year in November, we have this gathering where we have a great meal and like we mentioned, some wine, and we laugh a lot. We laugh
For
a
sure.
lot. I have loved our time together. Thank you so much for spending a very, very busy period of time to have this conversation. It's been so much fun. Thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Okay, be well. I just have one primary reflection from this episode, and it's really about kind of our source or our fuel. A couple times Kathy said, she talked about motivation. At one point she said, my number one motivator is giving voice to others who may not have it. And on another level, she talked about how her daughter is her number one source of motivation. It's so wonderful to speak with someone who's very, very clear on that source of their fuel, because the work she's doing is incredible and it's prolific, and she's doing a lot of it. And she's making a major contribution to leadership studies. As always, everybody, thank you for listening. Take care and be well. You have been listening to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast. If you liked what you heard, please share it with others and let them know what we're up to. And one last quick reminder to click subscribe so you know when we publish new episodes. And of course, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can stay in touch with me by visiting www.scottjallen.net or any number of social media platforms. Be well, be safe, and make a difference wherever you are on this beautiful planet. And now, here's Kate's twin sister, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.